My name is Tracy Kittle. I am on the executive board of directors for the Heroes Circle, and I'm here today with Victim to Hero to help facilitate our monthly event where we interview adults who were alienated from one of their parents as children. So with me today, we have a bit of a full house. I'm really excited to get to know everybody. We have Deborah, Tammy, Gareth, and Terry, if everybody wants to give a wave. And so first we're going to start off just by asking everybody to briefly introduce yourself and identifying if you were alienated from your father or your parent and who the alienator was. So Deborah, do you mind sharing, just briefly introducing and who you were alienated from?
I'd be happy to. I was alienated from my father by my mother.
Wow, how old were you?
Well, actually, she started when I was very young, but when it permanently happened, I was about 12.
Gotcha. And then Tammy, how about you? Oh, you're on your mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
sorry.
You're here now.
Okay, I was alienated from my father by my mother as well.
And
for
then
most of my life.
Most of your life, so it started happening as a child.
All right.
Gotcha. And then what about you, Gareth?
Just like everybody else, it seems I was alienated from my father by my mother, with the difference being, as an adult, my mother worked with my ex-wife to alienate me from my son as well.
I understand. And then last we have Terry, just a brief introduction of your situation.
I'm Terry, and my alienation started when my parents were divorcing when I was 12 years old.
Gotcha.
My mother was the alienator.
From your father?
Yeah.
Right. And then, so I'm going to go with you and kind of work a little bit backwards since we're still on you, Terry. What were some of the alienating behaviors? Do you remember? And then did you fall for the campaign, or was there a point where you were wise to it? Like a little bit more of that story.
I was very, very wise to it. I had two other siblings that developed into it. My mother was very abusive. From a very young age. I was 4 years old, and she was very physically abusive. My dad was an alcoholic, but he was not aggressive. But he was not supportive for my mother either. And I understand she was under a lot of stress. She ran businesses. And it started with just bad things being said back and forth when the divorce was happening. And then it came to a point where she owned businesses, so she didn't want my father to get any of it. So she sat me in a chair one day and said things to me like, "I know what your dad did to you. You can tell me what he did." I won't tell anybody. And it was just over and over. And she had my sister working with her and trying to get me to say. And finally, after probably an hour of sitting there and crying and screaming and not understanding why she's saying these things, that she said, "He sexually abused you. You can tell me." And I knew he didn't. I knew it. And then that's when I knew something was happening.
And that didn't start immediately. So you guys what age were you starting the divorce?
12.
And then was this immediately after, or was there some time?
It was
right
immediate.
after.
Yep.
Wow. That's pretty direct, right? When it happens immediately after.
Yeah. Well, it's when you grow up with an alcoholic parent, I realize now my codependency for it was because I didn't want them to fight, and they fought constantly, and my mother abused my father. So if the house was a mess, or if he fell asleep drunk and the turkey burnt in the stove, or he left the kitchen sink on and it drained everywhere, at 7, 8 years old, I would be the one to wake up every night and clean that mess before she got home and make sure it was perfect. So there was no fighting. Even if he was not home when I woke up, I would call my mother and ask where dad is. And he'd come home and go, "Oh my God, you didn't. Oh no, we have to go outside and put the tent up. We'll put the tent up and say I fell asleep out there." So it was just, how do I make this not be angry and hurtful? So that's how I ended up protecting him that way, still causing fights, and then him and my mother just, her trying to say that he sexually abused me. It was the icing on the cake for me. I sat there and I knew it. I knew exactly what was happening to me.
Wow. So, Gareth, how about
ma'am.
you? Identifying any specific alienating behaviors that were deployed on you?
A lot of what I ended up receiving was in hindsight. I was quite young when my parents got divorced, well, separated. It's about first grade, so about 5 or 6 when they separated. And it literally would start before that. My mother would tell people how abusive my father was. And that's why people forced her to leave him. But growing up, I have absolutely no recollection of my father's abusiveness. In fact, every memory I had of him prior to that was all positive. It was probably really after one incident with my father. He was under a lot of stress. He lost his temper and he struck my face. And I've spoken to him in recent years, and he recognizes how bad it was, and he accepted the consequences of those actions. But it literally was a one-time thing, and that just gave my mother more more fuel to the fire. After that incident, it became more evident that she was trying to get people's attention, that she was using that for people to sympathize with her. And one thing that she did would be to talk to me about my anger issues. She had me go into therapy because I was so scary to her. She once read a book about children who killed their parents because she was fearful that maybe one day me or my brother might do that. Then she had seen that there was an issue between me and my father. He had taken my brother out separate from me, and my brother had more fun than I did. So she used that to kind of control him. And I think he kind of broke. And I understand, being in the same position he was, how hard it is to keep fighting to be with your kids and have the other parent do everything to make you look like an absolute evil, POS. And so he kind of faded from our life. Then issues regarding child support. She would start feeding me information, how he's fought to reduce child support, how she had a story which now as an adult, I find completely not unbelievable, where he sent a blank check and she filled it in. And so he charged her with forgery, or had the police charge her with forgery. Just things like that. And eventually she would have me call him to find out where the money is. And so I would come across, I would attack him. And she, of course, played, the innocent, oh, if you want a relationship with your father. But as a child, that's not what they want. As a child, you pick up on how your parents feel, and you react to that. The words are meaningless, but you want to seek their approval and do what they want. So at around the age of 12, I essentially told my father, I want nothing to do with him, stay out of my life. Some very unpleasant words.
And how old were you again when the divorce started? So how long did it take?
The separation started around grade 1. I'm not sure when it was finalized. Luckily, that part before, it would have been between grades 1 and 5. So before I was 11-ish, the divorce would have been finalized. During that time, I really had no idea about what was going on. I did find out there's other secrets. There was other drama before I was born, which was really kind of interesting. But then as a teen, I was removed from the home because my mother would make false claims of me hitting her. She would strike me and I would try and get away. She called the police. I literally had the police break down the bathroom door while I was on the toilet. I was removed from the home 3 times. Had criminal charges pressed against me, all for lies and manipulation. And even then, I still kept going back to it. While I was in care of the government, when I was removed from the home, I would call her. She was always too busy vacuuming or doing the dishes or something. Never had time for me.
Yeah.
But when she had to speak to the social workers, she was nothing but, oh, I miss my kid and all that stuff. So she really played it up for sympathy. And I followed her to Thailand. And eventually I saw who she was. Those rose-tinted glasses just shattered. And once I did that, once I realized what she was and, stop playing her game, stop letting her be the victim, she turned on me and took advantage of issues between me and my ex-wife to kind of do the same thing over again.
Because you kind of see it, if you had that level of campaigning your whole life, right? And then you kind of see it as you become older, you see where it's happening in other places. Yeah. It
was literally a lightning bolt. It just, all of a sudden, the illusion was shattered, and you look back and you start to see the lies, the manipulation. Like I said, similar to, I think, what Deborah, who said that her mother, tried to put on the thought that she was sexually molested. That's exactly what my mother did with me, but with physical abuse, and did that to the people in our life.
Can I ask a question, Sarah?
Yeah.
Why did your mother go to Thailand?
She was involved. She was dating a guy who had a business importing silver into Canada, and one of their suppliers was here in Thailand. And at this point, it was kind of a compound of things. I had moved trans-Canada. My younger brother just had a kid, had just moved out. So there was the whole empty nest thing. And her boyfriend at the time, I honestly believe, was fed up with her. There's lots of times when I tried to speak to her, like, look, you gotta treat them better.
My mother went to Thailand as well. And that's why I find it, just wondering if there was a similarity there.
Unfortunately, Thailand is a place that tends to attract a lot of less than great people.
Yeah.
It's not something about the Thai people themselves, but the situation affords the less than ideal people. But for my mother, it was just, she was kind of not knowing what to do with her life, because, the major sources of interest in her were kind of gone. And she had pushed her boyfriend there pretty much to his limits. I mean, the guy is an amazing guy.
My mother went to become a missionary. So that's the religious scene behind it, I think, is what I'm trying to connect to see.
Yeah, no, my mother used religion like she uses people. It was to get attention.
Exactly.
As a child, she was a Baptist. At one point, she joined a nunnery rather than, taking care of her family. She decided to do that, get more interest in her. Then, as a teen, while I was in the care of the system, I had a anger management coach who happened to be Buddhist. And so my mother started going in that direction and started playing that up for people. Then coming to Thailand, oh, you're a white person who's Buddhist, you're something special. So it's all been about attention for her. But religion wasn't her reason for coming.
So she moved away, but moving away probably, I would imagine that exacerbated some of the alienation and even some of the success there. But I did want to make sure, I want to get over to Tammy. But Tammy, so what alienating behaviors do you remember? And yeah, like how, if there was an age where you did accept that, you were rejecting your parent, what happened there with you?
Sure. Well, my mom was a very overt narcissist. So she would do things that were just really out there, like move states. We moved states to get away from my father. And I hear a lot of my story that was intertwined with some of the others. She would call him abusive. He was an alcoholic, drug addict, child abuser, you name it. She was a CPS caller, cop caller, every time, every way she would try to do things like that. I think that I was probably around 9 when I started adopting her mentality, because we had that physical distance, and then even like he had supervised visitation and I wasn't allowed to hug him, so we had physical distance and like you name it. And so I really started to believe, I mean, on some level, internally I never really believed it. On an external level, I started adopting it. I had to kind of adopt it to survive, and so I started saying that. And when he would call, and he fought it really hard. So he fought for his phone calls and his time with me. And when that happened, I started to, though, my mom would be in my face right before the phone call, telling me things like, he doesn't care about you, and and then verbal abuse, when are you going to get it through your hard head that he doesn't care about you? And then if I did get on the phone, she wanted me to ask for money, sort of like, the child support stuff and all of that. And so I just started telling him that I didn't want to talk to him anymore, because it was easier for me to deal with. And we hear that so often with the kids saying, it's just easier if you don't put them in the middle. And then the alienated parent is the one that has the conscience to step back and then the alienation reinforces itself.
Yeah, I imagine that's definitely a similarity, I think, between you and Gareth. There is putting that already awkward topic of finances into small hands where they should probably never be, right? Like, I think we've all heard not putting kids in the middle. Yeah. And so, I mean, Deborah, so back over to you. What are the alienating behaviors that you remember from your parent? And was there an age that you started adopting that alienation of your parent?
Well, my mother actually started when they were still married. And I remember her referring to my father as the devil when I was before even kindergarten. So she was always talking behind his back and doing things that showed that he was bad and talking bad about him. She blamed him for everything that went wrong in our family, including not having money for things, including anytime we wanted something and he just wasn't working hard enough, or he had problems. He was a minister, so he must have problems in the church, that he's not getting enough money and that kind of thing. She was a full-time mom. She made us, when they separated and were getting divorced, she made us responsible for, like in Tammy's case, bringing home money or groceries every time we saw him. The financial end of things being played between the parents was really bad. My brother was not as affected as much as I was, but you asked at what age. I did not realize really what was going on. I bought it all hook, line, and sinker and adopted her view of things. It was the safer one because she beat us daily. And if we didn't go along with what she wanted, it was worse on us. So it was a matter of survival, just like it was for Tammy. You either bought into her program and reiterated what she said, or it was worse on you. She triangulated, I have an older brother who's 2 years older than I. She triangulated us so that we would never gang up against her. Kept us at odds with each other. And my father, as soon as they separated, of course, she prevented us from being able to see our father. And he took us back to court. And this was a significant moment for me. I remember distinctly. Like was it Terry, was that you that was saying that you seem to know really what it is that they expect of you? They may not actually say it, sometimes it's in your what you perceive of their face or their nonverbal cues, but I knew for a fact that when the judge took us into his chambers one by one, both of us kids, and asked us if our mother is interfering with our ability to see our father, I had to lie. It was a matter of survival, because I knew instinctively that if I told him the truth, it was going to get back to my mother. And guess who I was going home with that day? I was going home with mother. So she was not only going to beat me for the chores I didn't finish that day, but she was also going to beat me even worse if I told him the truth. So I had to lie to the judge at the age of 12 or 13. I don't remember which, but that is a very significant moment in my life that I remember distinctly, because a lot of legislation that's out there now is saying kids have that right to be able to speak in the courts. And who do you think's twisting their arms behind their backs?
Yeah. Yeah. So just to clarify, so it sounds like you had pretty much believed like this person's not good for you, like pretty much all the way through your childhood, and it was 12 or 13 that you started to question?
Nope.
No, you just still believed it all the way through then. Okay.
I loved my dad. I was daddy's girl.
Mm-hmm.
But the day they separated, it was just
See, I'm similar to you. Like my mother, I was daddy's girl too. Mom would come to me, she would beat me, she would do whatever she needed to do. And she would be the one to ask me the questions. Who do you love more, me or your father? Who do you want to live with, me or your dad? Of course I said my mother. If I didn't, what's going to happen to me? So
yeah, and it's not even necessarily that they say it though, right? Like it's that implied. We're so in tune to the silent expectations that a lot can happen that way and not even need to be said. Real quick before I go into my next question, I just wanted to throw it out there. Thank you so much, Cody. I know you're listening today, for sharing this in so many places. And if you guys do want to share or like this event to keep the word out there as we continue through our interview, please feel free to. So I did want to also ask so starting with you, Deborah, what types of things, like when that campaign was working, do you remember things that you had said to the targeted parent, essentially? Like, did any of that "you're a bad person" message ever come from you or anything like that?
I don't remember ever being cruel to him, except for one time. And my father really tried to pursue the matter. And he was consistently sending letters. I was not real cruel. The only thing I ever did, I was a real shit one time, pardon the French, when he continued to force us to go to visit against our will. And by that point, I was actually babysitting and had a little business of babysitting and that kind of thing. And I never knew for sure if he was going to actually take us during his custodial time or not. So it was difficult for me to set appointments. And I did tell him that, that it was hard and I didn't want to go, because I wanted to go, but I didn't. And it started creating such anxiety within me from my mother. I remember one time in particular, I couldn't sleep before I had to go with him. I was up until I only got 2 hours sleep. And as a 12-year-old, I was exhausted that day. I couldn't be friendly. I couldn't be nice. I told him I didn't want to go. He made me go. And I was just silent. I didn't speak, period.
Yeah, so you kind of started where you're almost being set up to have a bad time before it's even an option to go over there, to have the time that you would have had you been well rested and things like that.
And that was all anxiety ridden because I couldn't sleep. I was just upset about the whole thing. So yeah. But I wasn't especially nasty. There was maybe 2 times that happened. Another time I just refused to speak, period, because he was remarried by this point and his wife was nasty to me. I get the fact that I already have a mother who beats me, but to have a stepmother who's going to be nasty to me. She actually took me aside one time and shook the living daylights out of me and said, "Your father loves you." My glasses go flying and she tells me to take my headgear out because she doesn't want to get hurt by hitting me. And I'm like, this is the last, in my mind, this is the last time I'm going to see my dad. I'm going to go talk to the family person and tell them, I'm never going to get married. This is what I did. I'm never going to get married because I'd be afraid of getting stuck with somebody like that.
Yeah, like it really like feeling that almost level of rejection twice, like when you've got a stepmom in the situation that kind of feels like it's not helping. What about you, Tammy? What kinds of things did you end up actually saying to the targeted parent in your situation?
I would tell my dad, like, I don't want you around. I don't, if he offered, I'd say, no, don't come. I don't want you to be there. Because, I would just deny him almost anything. I would deny, even when we got to the point where he was giving hugs again, I would push him off and say, I don't want you around. I don't want you to hug me. But I was internalizing that lost relationship with him.
Mhm.
I was turning it against him. I was blaming him because I had a hole in me, because I missed him, because I loved him. He was a good father. He was a loving father. And since he wasn't able to be in my life, and I had my mother telling me that it was his fault, like, he would, one of the things she would say, like, if he loved you, he would find a way to be here. He would find a way to do these things and kind of jump through her hoops. And so I just really took that out on him.
Yeah.
And he actually died when I was 23. And so even up until he died, even though I was starting to gain understanding through him, like, he was so helpful as far as following the steps to help enlighten me and to help me become healthy, as an adult. I still didn't fully get it. So I was still taking a lot of that out on him.
Yeah. So unfortunately, like, so at the time though, when you were saying it, did you have that sense that, or did you really feel empowered in that it was your decision and these were your feelings?
I can remember some things he would say to me that would really, again, he was obviously, purposely saying certain things to me. And one thing he would say is, Tammy, it sounds like you have a lot of animosity towards me, or stuff, just very calm things. He would just identify how I felt. He would let me feel it. And I could tell now more as a parent, I can look back and see and remember the look on his face being pain, and be able to really see how much pain I was causing him. But he just really never stopped holding my hand through it.
But like, you as a child, you didn't immediately see, like, I'm saying this to him just to cause pain. You were just saying your belief, but it's later in life that you realized how hurtful those things were.
Yeah, it wasn't until I'm 40 now. It really wasn't until I had children that started getting older that I realized, and I started thinking about the issues that I was having with my children and seeing patterns within my family and stuff, that it really just hit me hard. Basically, now that I'm 20 years after the fact, which has come to me in a process of steps over time, the clarity as far as what happened, to really understand and accept the full parental alienation, and just how toxic and how powerful it was, and how powerful it was, not just in my childhood and my father's life, but even in my adult life. Even over these last 20 years that I've been an adult, it's been affecting me.
Yeah. So I want to pop back to Deborah really quick, and then I'll continue with the same question with Gareth and Terry, because Deborah, when you said those things and you were rejecting your targeted parent, did you know at the time how hurtful it was, or was that something that more came to you later?
No, I actually, kind of like Gareth mentioned, in my own situation, being alienated from my kids, I just reflect back on what it's done to my dad, or what I did do to my dad. And I realized how awful it was. But I have something that I ran across a few years ago that just really hit home. I found a letter that my mother had written to my brother and I the year after my parents' divorce. So this is like 1975. I can't believe she actually put it in writing. She said, "I hope this is the last letter of this nature I have to write to you." And she went on to describe how to commit psychological warfare against my father, how to cause his stomach to be upset, how to give him diarrhea, how to do all these things to him. And she outlined them in this letter. And she went on and on and on. And I'm reading this thing and I'm saying, I don't remember ever seeing this. And I read on, I turned the page over, and on the back is my handwriting adding to it. That's how brainwashed I was.
Yeah, and then to see it in your own hand, because do you remember writing it, or was it almost like a, hey, surprise, I found this in my own handwriting as a child? It was kind of a surprising.
Yeah. And I sent that to my brother, and he didn't remember it either. So it's like this part of your life that you don't, I mean, that is how controlled I was.
Man. And then, so to go back kind of in the order we were doing, Gareth, what types of things did you end up saying to your targeted parent? And then at the time, did you know it was wrong, or is it more like what we're realizing with Tammy and Deborah? It kind of didn't really come to your realization until you were older.
I'd say a little bit of both, to be honest. I felt angry at him because I knew that's what my mother wanted, but also because he wasn't there. And I wanted to hurt him. He hurt my mother. He hurt me. He's obviously a bad guy. He's not paying his child support. I remember it was soon after the divorce. He said to me, well, now you're the man of the house. And I never realized the impact those words had on me. Because at that point, I was the man of the house. You owe this money to my household. You're going to pay it. And I was quite vulgar. My voice, I'd be yelling at him to the point where my voice would go raspy. Just spitting out all this spite. It wasn't even anger. It was literal spite. I wanted him to feel bad. I wanted him to know that I don't love him. I don't think I said those words to him, but I wanted him to feel that. And during those years, I felt, I wasn't aware of it, but I felt conflicted. I wanted my father. I loved him, and I knew I loved him. I knew I wanted him. But at the same time, he was this wretched person. It was somebody who I don't want in my life. I would never treat my kids the way he treated us, which is ironic because he treated us amazingly well, considering how little time he had with us. And one of the things I talked with my aunt about is like, if he was really so abusive, his current wife, his 13-year-old kid, why was his kid never taken from the home when both me and my brother were taken from my mother? So I look back at the time, and it's like, I was too young to be aware of what I was doing. So when I hear people going back to talking about having the kids share their views in court, well, I think it's important to listen to the kids. In the court situation with a judge, it's a lot of pressure. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there could be much better ways it's done, less formal, less, more kids talking, not really, kind of the pressure that worry about consequences and whatnot.
Right.
It's like the show Kids Say the Darndest Things. You get the kids comfortable, they're going to just spew out the truth. But kids, they are only aware of the immediate consequences of their actions. Like you said, if I go home and I don't say what my mother wants me to say, I'm going to get beat.
Yeah.
They're not able to assess the situation in the long term. One of the things I face a lot here, and I've literally, on a date, no less, had a woman ask me, well, why doesn't your kid want to be with you? If he wanted to be with you, he would. And I had to get up and leave because I was filled with so much anger, because the assumption that a kid, when I use kid, I mean everything up until freaking 25 years old. I mean,
there's
I'm
a lot that's
40,
not,
said she's 40,
yep,
I'm sorry, I still forget that I'm not 19, right? I still see, relationships with my friends that they're still acting like freaking teenagers. We just don't grow up. But I would argue, how can we ask a kid to make that decision?
Yeah.
Because
But
we don't allow a 12-year-old child to drive. We don't let them choose whether or not they go to school. We don't let them vote. And I'm sorry, but voting, one single vote has less of an effect on that person's life than asking a 8-year-old kid, who do you want to live with?
Right.
And even if the other parent is not abusive, even if the one parent isn't trying to put a wedge between the other parent, the child is almost always going to choose the person that they live with. That's the safety. Whether or not, even in cases of abuse, the child is going to choose that safety. It's safer to go with what you know than what you don't.
yeah. Well, and when you're a child, it's like when that's the home, you're going to every night, you might not realize that you can say things to have an effect, like where you go at the end of that process being done. But
Sorry, one more thing about that as well is a lot of times also there's a cultural pressure on children to pick the mother. Society kind of pushes people to go in that direction. It's not a vindictive thing, but there is things. You look at religion, right? The Virgin Mother. Here in Thailand, it's a very, very rooted thing where mothers are automatically good. There's this belief that they are, just by the fact that they've given birth, they are a good person,
yeah.
which is not always the case. So there is a cultural aspect that children are sensitive to as well.
Thanks for sharing, Gareth. But I wanted to continue with the same question with Terry. So Terry, what types of things did you end up saying to your targeted parent? And then at the time, did you know it was wrong, or was that something you more came to later?
There was absolutely nothing I've ever said to him in a negative way. Nothing.
Yeah.
After my mother paid him $10,000 to leave the province, I spent the next 8 years trying to find him. I called 411. I knew he was in Toronto. I knew that I had to pick my mother. I knew that that's what I had to do. And she would tell me that he's an alcoholic. He would never be able to look after you. He would never be able to do anything. And to this day, I look at who would have been the better parent. I can't answer that. I don't know who would have been the better parent. Would it have been him? If I left and went with him in Toronto and he was an alcoholic, where would have I ended up? Did I stay with her and continue to let her beat me and get where I am right now? I don't even know how to answer that, but I do know that he left. He was gone for 8 years. He tried to phone us. My sister and my brother completely sided with my mother. And whenever I asked to talk to him when he called, I was never allowed to speak with him. I always had a very close connection with him. He was my protector. When I was being beaten, he would jump in between us and he would end up getting beaten. He was black and blue. I was black and blue. It never stopped. So I had a lot of guilt inside of me, and I knew I just had this feeling inside of me. I had to stay with my mother, and I was never scared of him. I was nervous to go visit him. I was anxious because my mother would be saying things before I go. While I'm there, I'm throwing up at his house. My nerves were shot. I had the diarrhea. I had to leave early and go back to mom, but didn't want to and wanted to stay with him. But he wasn't the greatest caretaker because he was an alcoholic. But at the same time, he was a gentle, kind person. My sister became very aggressive with my father, and it divided us all. There's 3 of us. For the first time in 25 years, I have just started talking back with my sister after recognizing what I'm going through with my own daughter. I'm like, my patterns have come back. This whole generational cycle is now in front of me. My daughter is 12 years old and she's being alienated from me and I can't see her. So why is that? And my sister and I, she reached out to me after I left an abusive relationship because that's where it all stems from. The abuse was taught to me at 4 years old. So every relationship I have, I'm going to make sure they punch me, give me black eyes, or say hurtful, meanful things to me because that's all I know. And I figured out that's not normal. That is not normal.
It's always gutting to hear like the intergenerationalness of trauma and abuse, like especially if it's physical or particularly in these situations, you know. Yeah, but so I guess I just want to go ahead and go to the next question with you, Terry, if you're fine with that. When did you realize that you were a victim of parental alienation? And was there like a particular trigger or a moment that just really made it come into clarity for you?
There's two things I can think of that definitely triggered it. And it was when my mother took me for a drive, just her and she pulled over and she asked me, who do I want to live with? Me or your dad? And who do you love more, me or your father?
Oof.
And then after I said it was her I want to, I was scared to death. I didn't know what to do. I want to live with you, but inside my head is saying I want to live with dad. And then when she sat me in that chair and then tried to pin him for sexually abusing me, I knew then at 12 years old what she is capable of doing. I knew it. She has 3 businesses that in a small city, she is well established and he can have half of that. But she took $10,000 and flagged it in front of an alcoholic's head and said, leave the province.
Yeah. And then of course there's with the allegations. Do you think that had anything to do with why he would have taken that?
It never went any further because I sat there and cried my eyes out saying he never did this to me. So she couldn't bring that forward to court. He left shortly after that and came back. He came back 8 years later. She said that he was sick. She said she bought him a ticket and she said to me, you don't need me anymore. You never loved me. And now your father's here and he can look after you. And I was devastated. I'm like looking at my mother crying. Oh my God, I love you. I love you too. And that's not it. And he came back and she boarded him actually in one of the homes that she owned. And he found a place, both him and I got him a place, and he ended up dying within that year. So I got to see him again, and I didn't get to do everything I wanted to. And I didn't get to say all the things I wanted to say to him, but I was his next of kin. I was the 18-year-old kid sitting at the undertaker's office trying to figure out what kind of a casket I'm going to put my father in, while my mother saying horrible things and reminding myself of my brother hates my father. My sister wouldn't even visit him in the hospital. And it was just like, my God, he's going to die. And now that we have talked and we've connected over this past year, she's like, I can't believe the stories you're telling me compared to what mom told me. And what she's saying, what my mother said about me, she's divided us all so we would never communicate.
Yeah, I feel there's a lot of that can happen when there are siblings involved. I know I had a brother, but there's a lot of triangulation. Yeah. So I'm sending a virtual hug to you. I so understand this.
I feel really bad. My brother, we don't speak much at all. And he sent me a message the other day and he said in his letter, how did he say it? I apologize to mom for being a bad kid. Ugh. And I'm like, man, you just don't get it. Not yet, you don't get it. And we're not going to connect. And I don't think we ever will. And that's okay, but maybe someday he will understand that it's not his fault. It's not his fault.
And it sounds like you've at least given yourself as like an openness to your siblings. Like they know they can come to you, which is probably going to be a good thing. But yeah, so our next, Gareth, I know you're angry, you moved away at 12 and then in Thailand, so that had to really also make things a little bit complicated. But when did you realize that you were a victim of parental alienation? And then did you have a specific trigger or aha moment that woke you up to it?
It would have definitely been in the last decade. To be honest with you, this so long ago, I'm not exactly sure. But I think it was just, like I said, there was kind of this crashing of the illusion I had of who this person was. And I started looking back over my life and just putting the pieces back together, seeing the manipulation, the lies in the present, the lies in the past, how things she says now don't add up. How, when I read my case report from my time in care, didn't align with what she said. He just started realizing, wait a minute, if A and B are not true, what about C and D? So I start looking at that and I start realizing my whole life I was gaslit. I was manipulated to believe that I had an anger management problem. I was manipulated to believe that my father was this abusive man. In fact, I look back and it makes me laugh because she likes to tell the story of when she walked in and caught me choking myself. And she says that I was telling her, well, I'm practicing to protect Kyle, my younger brother, because of her alcoholic, abusive boyfriend, Alan. This guy, I mean, I was quite young at the time. So, I wouldn't have picked up on whether or not he was actually alcoholic or not, but the guy never laid a finger on me as far as I can remember. I don't have a single bad memory of the guy, and I remember his curly hair. I mean, it always struck me as kind of odd that she remembers this, but I don't. But she's the adult. She's the parent. Mm-hmm. I accept that as true. But then I look back, I'm like, that never happened.
And this was the boyfriend in Thailand? Because I know you kind of
this was a boyfriend around the time she was getting divorced.
Okay.
The boyfriend who she left to come to Thailand, guy who kind of pushed her to come to Thailand, he was a super sweet guy. There was absolutely no way that anybody would believe anything negative about him. And the thing was, he took good care of her financially. She's not, I don't want to call her a gold digger, but she literally said to me that she will never date another poor man again. And next person she's involved with is from one of the richest families in the region where she lives. So yeah, there's a lot of manipulation going on with, financial resources. I mean, she claimed to have inherited money from her aunt, bought a house that we lived in. And when she left my father, he had gone to the bank, put his name on the mortgage, and then sold it without her permission. And I get the 80s were a little bit different than, nowadays, but I still have a hard time believing that the bank would allow a guy to go in, put his name on somebody else's mortgage, and then allow him to sell that house. Yeah. So I get everything I kind of realize is all hindsight. It all kind of like, it just doesn't add up. It just kind of.
Yeah, but since you kind of got to see that pattern of how she did, right?
Yeah, and I grew up with the pattern. I grew up kind of this nagging, just a little nag that I'd ignore, just in the back of my head there, and it just was always there. But she's the mother, she's the adult, she's the parent. You got to accept.
Yeah, that's like a lot of our that is our news feed for the longest time, isn't it? It's just kind of what the parent ends up telling you, and that can base a lot of your truth. But
there's an interesting thing I noticed, people talking about their siblings, that kind of noticed in a pattern where I know with my relationship with my brother and mother, it was, you guys used the word triangle. we had it was described as a hero, victim, villain complex, where my brother would switch roles as hero and victim, and I would be the villain. And it seems that it's not just them alienate the parents, but the siblings from each other. And I honestly thought that part was something kind of really my relationship with my brother. I hadn't really realized that, parents had done that to other people as well.
So, Tammy, about how old were you when you had the realization that you were a victim of PA? I know, unfortunately, your father passed. It sounded like it didn't come until after, but can you talk about what that was like coming to that realization?
Sure. I'll tell you my biggest one. And then there had been smaller ones with my father first, but the biggest one, and while we're on the subject of siblings, again, my younger sister, I saw my mom try very hard to alienate her from her children. And I saw the motives come into play, and the same players come into play as far as my extended family. And I watched her go through this process, and she tried to bring me into it. And I was brought into this triangulation with my sister. I stood really firm, and I believe that I was the player that stopped that from happening. However, now fast forward, 5 years after that, my sister is still very much entrenched again with my mother. I have no relationship with my sister again, because we are not allowed to have a relationship because of the difficulty that I gave my mom trying to help my sister maintain her children. Now my sister feels loyalty to my mom, and of course, it's her, as far as my mom being the main alienator. If you're in that, if you agree to that, then you've got to play by her rules. And so that was the biggest one. And that's when I really started to think about putting terms in it, because I knew that I had an abusive mother, and I knew that I had been separated from my father, and I was still sorting through whose fault that was. And I really hadn't come to saying, hey, this is your fault. You did very outright, just outrageous things. And I saw her do it in my adult life with my sister. So there's really no denying it now. I've seen her do it again. So now, that's when I think, parental alienation, it's a word, somebody is doing it. It is child abuse. So that's kind of the point I'm at now.
Yeah, just kind of unpacking your own situation to try to figure out where things started, I think can lead a lot of people to a little bit of this journey. How about you, Deborah? About what point did you realize you were a victim of parental alienation, and how old were you?
Well, I have a real defining time. When I was around 21, I was in college, and I had introduced my college buddy to my mother. And after that, he made a comment to me, and he said, I really think you need to turn around and take another look at your father. He may not be as bad as you think he really is. He went on to meet my father because of that. And that really made me start taking a closer look at what happened. And it's been a gradual process for me. But what really, really drove it home was when my own children were alienated from me. I started seeing the whole process and remembered what it was like for me, and seeing the separation and the changes and the whole thing. So, yeah, that was pretty much it. It's just been a real gradual thing. And the more I know, the more I see, the more I realize, oh yeah, that happened to me. And the more reading I've done about the narcissistic personality disorder, that letter I referred to that came from my mother a year after they were divorced, in there she talks about poor me, meaning her, how all these awful things my father's done to her, poor her, why we, remember now, kids, she's talking to us, my brother and I, remember your father has done this to you too, and this is why we don't have the money, reiterating all the things that she said. But poor me was a real big highlight in that letter.
Yeah.
Reeks of narcissism.
No, it is kind of interesting when you can see, like, it gets more hindsight the older you get, right? And the more you learn about the world. So I'll go ahead and, so this is actually, we got a question from Jem, that kind of aligns with the next one that I've got. Jem from the chat had asked if there was anything the other parent could do when they have zero contact with you, or any particular message that resonates well. And that's really just, is there anything you feel that your targeted parent could have done? And do you mention if it was a no contact situation, I suppose? So Deborah, could you go ahead?
Yeah, actually, my father continued to write to us kids, and being a minister of a church, he also had a church bulletin that they sent out. So I'd get like one a week from him on those. And of course, mother would always read the letters before she let us see them. She'd always comment negatively on them, but we did get to see them. That was pretty amazing. And I did the same thing with my target kids. So I didn't write to them as much, but I would send them, when I did have contact, cute little puppy and kitty things, funny things, just lighthearted nothings. It kind of just says, I love you, I'm thinking of you, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Do you think that
Innocent.
was helpful for you? Like,
Yeah,
to
I
get that
do.
from him, even if were you ever really positively responsive to those things you got from him?
I didn't respond to him because that was a no-no. I would have been in trouble from
Right.
Mom. But I knew
But
he
you
cared.
did love them.
I
You
knew,
enjoyed
yeah,
them.
I knew he cared. He would write letters. I mean, I knew he cared. And that had to be just heart-wrenching for him. I know it had to be. But the one thing I failed to mention was, yes, my friend turned me around, but I was reunited with my father and got to spend the next 25 years of his life with him. If it wasn't for that intervention of my friend, I can't say that I ever would have.
And how old were you when you got, so that actually kind of
21?
leads into if there was anybody else that could have done anything. So a friend talking to you, how old were you
Yeah,
then?
21. When that frontal lobe is developing. Yeah.
Still wrapping some things up for a few years, but yeah, it gets a little bit more in tune there, I think.
And also
yeah.
my mother had moved out of state. So the fact that she was away and not yapping about how bad my dad is gave me an opportunity to actually see him in his own light.
Right. You could get some of that message that's been told to you over and over out of your head. And it's almost like
It's
a
still
detox.
there.
Oh, it's well, but
It's
I mean, at
still
least
there. I
being
have to
separated.
filter it. I do.
Yeah.
I think once you're brainwashed, I think you always have to have that. Maybe I'm just guessing, but I have to struggle with it. Oh, that's not my thought. That was mother's. And I wonder if Gareth, if some of those thoughts and feelings you have, if those aren't really yours and maybe are really your mother's.
They were
Right.
definitely mine. They were, kind of manipulated into me.
That's
I
what I'm
honestly
saying.
believed it.
Yeah.
It was how I felt. Like I said, I was ambivalent about it. I felt both ways. I wanted him. I wanted to hurt him. I didn't understand why, but all I knew is that that's what I wanted. You see it in abusive relationships where the abused partner wants to please the abusive partner. Even though they know they should leave them, they stay. And it's the same idea. A child, a partner, they struggle with the feelings. They may be manipulated into believing that they're worthless. And they believe it. And that's something I struggle with now. I still feel rather quite undeserving of a compassionate partner. But that's not because of, that wasn't just planted on me. That was planted within me.
I
I
understand,
think that's
because
the difference.
I hated my dad. I thought I did anyway. I mean,
Well,
that
I
was
did.
implanted in me.
Unequivocally, I hated him. When I called him and I wanted that child support check, he's a bastard. I just want justification. It's you see it with your friends. You sit down and you talk with your friends. Don't get me wrong. There's sometimes where you break up with a person for a very good reason. Sometimes some people need a kick, where the sun don't shine. But a lot of times, we share things with our friends. We only share half the story. We share the effect that, the part that affected us. We don't share the part where our actions led to the other person's actions. And again, I'm not justifying any sort of abuse here. I'm just saying that sometimes our behavior changes over time, and that leads our partner's behavior to change over time. And our friends only see how, oh, they don't love you anymore. They don't take care of you anymore. They don't this. Your ex-boyfriends is horrible. So there's a lot of that in it as well, that people just kind of take on and support what one person says.
Yeah, like that
And-
over supportiveness almost to kind of you detrimentally affect
Or-
like even the memories there.
Well, even in the news, you see it. Somebody is accused of murder or rape or something, and people jump on it. They're simply accused. Oh, they're automatically guilty. And because of what I went through and how it affected me, I actively challenge myself on absolutely everything because I don't want to fall into that trap again.
Yeah.
When I hear something, I automatically stop myself from reacting and say, there's more to it. I'm not going to let another person's experience or words dictate how I'm going to feel.
So Gareth, while we're on you really quick, was there anything that your targeted parent could have done? It sounds like you were actually kind of on that no contact kind of space for a while.
I pushed him. I made it very clear that I wanted him out of my life. He wrote me one letter. I read it. I cried because I wanted him. But I'm not allowed to feel that. I have to hate him. Not because my mother says I have to hate him, because I told myself I have to hate him. It came from me. She led me there, but it came from me. And worst part was about 2 years after I got that letter, I'm visiting I brought a friend over to my mother's house to hang out, and there's a knock on the door. I open the door. Is your mother home? No. Is your brother home? No. Okay, well, thank you. Walks off. It wasn't until I closed that door that I clued into who it was. It was my father. And the ironic thing about that to me was, so that I was about 15 at that time. When I was about 11, me and my family were sitting in the living room, and we have this kind of bay window in the front of the house with these translucent white curtains. And we see this shape walk by. You can't see the face or anything. I'm like, that's my father. I ran upstairs and hid. Because at this point, it wasn't so much, oh, he's a bad guy. It's now he's been absent from my life. And I've been missing that, and I don't know how to react.
Yeah.
But family downstairs, like, what are you going through? How do you know that was him? And it's like, it's my father, of course I know. But then just a few years later, I'm completely blind to who he is. And the weirdest part is him, my brother, and I, you put us in the room and you know we're all related. You know there's no ands or buts. But it wasn't until I closed that door that I realized who it was. And again, the emotions just rushed through me. Like, I wanted to run out there and say, Daddy, but at the same time, I can't. I can't move. I cannot be the person to reach out to him. But if he reaches out to me, I'm going to reject him. So unfortunately for him, there was absolutely nothing he could do to be in my life.
You had such that resentment built up at that point that pretty much anything he would have sent or done, you don't think would have been helpful?
Nothing. Anything he did upset me. And I would change that sadness into anger, because that is how I'm supposed to feel towards him. He's the one who abused me. He's the one who left. He's the one who doesn't pay child support. He's the one who's made my life miserable. He's in the army. He makes all this money. We're living in poverty. I'm eating white bread and carrots. Well, he has a nice car and stuff. It just, you're a kid and you don't understand. Well, the finances in my situation are on my mother, not on him. But it was actually after I had my kid. He had contacted my uncle because his work, he needed security clearance. And part of that, they do research into, your family and whatnot. And he asked my uncle if he could ask for permission to use some of my details in this. And I remember just crying almost the whole night, and finally telling my uncle, yes, he can, and let him know if he wants to, he can contact me. And from there, we've had kind of an online relationship, but even then, even at the age of about 30, I could not reach out to him.
It still had, and it was a silent expectation. It's not like you had put up a banner saying, hey, Dad, reach out. He had to kind of guess when to kind of get back into your life.
And there was no way he could guess,
Mm.
because anytime he tried, it just reinforced that wall I was building.
Mm-hmm. Like, I built this, I said, stay away. And even though it is an attempt to try to reconnect with you, it's still seen as almost like an offense to that wall.
Yeah, exactly. And then if he doesn't try, it just adds to the wall as well. It was a lose-lose situation.
Yep. It's like, no matter what, because if you don't try, I'm just going to keep building my wall thicker the longer you don't try. But if you do try, well, then that's what the wall was there for, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I faced the same thing with my kid. People ask me, well, why don't you just go and visit him? I'm like, well, first of all, I can't be near his mother right now. I try not to harbor negative emotions, but there's two people in my life who I just am currently unable to forgive.
Yes.
And she's one of them. And she is also one of my triggers. She can set me off. She knows how to make me angry. And if my son sees us arguing in the least, he's going to go to her. And if I go to him, I'm trespassing. This is his space. I'm the bad guy. If I step there, it has to be a delicate walk, and he has to find his way, and I have to keep the path open.
So move on to kind of backtrack a little bit. I know I skipped Tammy just a second ago. So Tammy, what about you? Was there anything that your targeted parent could have done, or even anybody else in this situation could have done, that would have kind of helped prevent this, or maybe even resolve, like to come back from it?
I think, key people, people in the community. So that's why awareness is so important. I had a few people in my mother's community where she had taken us to this remote place that actually were able to sort of identify what was going on and speak to me. But my father also was able to put me in contact with a therapist who understood. And the way that he did that, we did have some contact, he and I. We had supervised visits over holidays. He brought a therapist to he and I's Thanksgiving dinner once. And he introduced them as his therapist. He said, this is my therapist. I need to talk to him today. And of course, I didn't really even get that until I rethought it, here again, just a few years ago. In the last few years, I thought, oh, that was for me. I just now get it, because the therapist did talk to me, and he was able to just say some things that gave me space in my mind, space away from my mother in my mind, space in my mind where she wasn't dominating. So things didn't change right then, but I just began to get space. And then he prompted and he pushed for my independence after that. He didn't push for my relationship with him. He had become an advocate for me at that point. He had grieved and lost our relationship as far as a normal father-daughter relationship, but he stayed only as an advocate and sort of worked it that way. And I think maybe that was really key for me. And that if a parent, and also here, we have 5 children of parental alienation here, and we were all abused. The child is most likely dealing with some pretty heavy abuse in that home. And so you've got to look at the child as abused, and you're their advocate, and they're in an abusive situation that they're stuck in. And just sort of work any avenue of the community that you can. And I realize how hard that is. I do realize how difficult that is.
So would you say that him being able to process, like, the whole idea that he couldn't go back in time and fix things, but to just kind of accept what had happened and work on being his most well self, do you think that's what kind of resulted in things like bringing a therapist and kind of almost having a little bit of that safe space for you? It sounds like having that person that could talk to you.
I do. I think it cost him personally, but doesn't it cost us all personally either way? I do think that he worked really hard to get to acceptance, and it's a hard walk. But I do think that that is beneficial if you can get to that place. And that, of course, trips people up in the beginning because of the grief process. The grief process is the hard part in the beginning.
Yeah, it's like,
For
let
the
us
parent.
not ever like low claim like how hard the grief process is, even some of us accepting this as the kids. So, and I know for me, it's given me a lot of compassion and empathy for what my own father probably went through. Yeah, that sounds like it was a really interesting experience. I don't think I've talked to anybody yet that had a therapist show up for Thanksgiving, but it almost sounds like that was a good step. Like, it
Oh yeah, because it was someone who obviously understood. And I even just recently saw one of the pamphlets for parental alienation that I recognized. And I do remember even being shown some paperwork, and it didn't really click fully for me at that point. However, it opened up enough space in my mind to allow me to grow into a healthy adult, which I think I would have gotten caught up with my mother had I not had just that little bit of space at that age.
Yeah. So Terry, move on to you for this one. So I think you know the question, but just recapping in case anybody's listening. Targeted parent, what could they have done to either help prevent or possibly come back sooner? If there's anything you feel they could have done.
My father could have done anything. He wrote his letters. I will always cherish them and I will keep them. But what Tammy just spoke of is exactly what I needed. I needed for somebody to advocate for me, somebody to bring this attention, a family member or somebody to be strong enough to stand up. And I realized that's what I have to do for my daughter. I haven't seen her in almost a year. She lives 3 minutes down the road from me. I wrote our Prime Minister a letter. I got a response from him. I have advocated myself with Be the Peace Institute. I am trying to bring knowledge to other parents and families going through this similar situation. It doesn't just affect our parents, but her brother. My son has lost his father, his grandparents, and his sister last year. He lost 4 people. I lost 1. And that's what I am seeing, the effects of all of this happen and tearing apart a family that doesn't need to be torn apart. My ex-husband came to me tomorrow and said, okay, you know what, you might be right a little bit. Okay, that's fine. Let's get on with it. Forget the past. Who cares? Let's move forward. I am willing. He needs my help tomorrow. I'm definitely going to be there to help him. I always helped him. We were divorced in 2017. It's 2021, and this only happened a year ago. We had a great relationship. There's no need of whatever happened because you're mad at me because I got in another relationship, or you're mad at me because of whatever reason. It doesn't matter. Every email you can look at it, you're only hurting the children. We're only hurting the children. Can you please step back for a moment and look at everything? He can never do that, and he won't. So advocating is definitely what has to be done. It doesn't matter who it is, but it needs to be somebody. It doesn't have to be that parent. It could be a friend. Like she's in school right now in grade 8, and she's talking about mental health projects that she has to do, and she needs to identify with a mental health issue. Well, what do you think you might not want to talk about? I don't say it, but I let you know.
Well, it sounds like a few of us would agree with the idea that this kind of cultural acceptance of demonizing an ex in general, whether there are children involved or not, like might actually be playing into this too. It's damaging, and then it's double damaging when there are kids involved. And then, go ahead, Terry.
Here's the difference, and I don't know if it's helpful or what, but our children are 10 years apart. So I have a 12-year-old, we have a 12-year-old and a 22-year-old. And going through all of this, our 22-year-old son has come to me and physically told me, this is what's happening inside of the house. This is what they're saying to us. This is what they're saying. What can I do? And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, I now have text messages that actually state my ex-husband's trying to spiritually abuse my daughter and trying to convince her to go back home because my ex-husband's dead father is there visiting her. So I have these pieces of information. I have a text that says, who loves you more? And Danielle saying, Mom does. And him saying, no one loves you more than I do. That's how I know most. I got all of this information. I have the proof, and I have to just distribute it properly. It's reading it put me in such a state that how do I stop? And me reacting in sadness was not helping me. I had to act in a positive way to show something in some way. Here is the proof. Why is this? It's been proven by Department of Community Services that she is being psychologically abused. She is being psychologically abused, and they cannot remove her from the home.
So I know I've got a handful of questions left, and it sounds like we've got a dog trying to speak up for us too.
Neighbors' dogs, really annoying.
No worries.
things
All
going, yeah.
voices are welcome in this platform.
Oh, not these ones. You'll have to excuse me a minute here.
Well, we are a little like we've still got some questions left, but I did want to go ahead and just remind people to please feel free to subscribe to the mailing list on Victim to Hero's website. And then we do also have an event tomorrow specifically for Parental Alienation Awareness Day. So all of that information is available through the website as well. So back to just a handful of questions, and then we'll get to more of the questions that we're getting in the chat room. So who here that is reunited successfully with their parent? Does anybody here feel like that they successfully reunited? Okay, so Deborah, why don't you go first? So if you did reunite, how did that process go? And are there anything that you would suggest like that went really well versus things that were a little bit more clunky?
I have to say that the biggest part about it was that I was open. My mother, like I mentioned earlier, she had moved out of state, so she was no longer there yapping in my ear. And I was open to my father to talk to him about it. And we actually sat down one Thanksgiving, Tammy, and we actually had a long time of just talking about it, which by that time I was mid to late 20s, I think, by the time we really sat down and talked about it. And it was just a meeting of hearts, and we just so I think by that time I had processed most of I'd been away from my mother long enough to be able to clean out most of the garbage and really bring in my dad and kind of restore that. So I guess I'm not very helpful with answering your question, because it just happened. It was a kind of a natural process, and it just evolved. There was nothing structured about it. There was nothing unusual. Maybe his being a minister helped, because he did a lot of counseling with other people and other families. So maybe he was able to, bring the olive branch with him, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so maybe he knew how to, he certainly had enough years to lament and to be hurt by it.
Yeah.
To think about what he would do.
Do you think it was better that he asked for like a holiday? Do you think that made it more comfortable? Like, hey, it's not just let's go have coffee out of nowhere. Was that something that maybe helped you feel comfortable meeting him? Like that it had an extra purpose of being a holiday? Or would you have been open, like even if it was just coffee on a Tuesday?
Well, we lived hours apart by that point. He had left the small town that we'd been a whole family in when they when my parents split up, and then he continually moved a little bit further and further away, depending on, where he and his second wife lived, and then where he and his third wife lived. So coffee wouldn't have been an option. It was, I had to actually make the effort and go make a visit. But he did also drive back to where my brother and I still lived, that area. And he would make those drives, and they were like 7-8 hour drives. So yeah, he certainly made an effort. So coffee wouldn't have done it. It was a very long conversation, but I don't think that was necessary. The feelings were already there.
Yeah, you were already kind of ready. You might not have needed, because you'd mentioned like, hey, one thing to mention about your situation is the openness, right?
Yes.
Because I guess that's some of the gamble. I'm sure many of our parents out there would agree is my adult child even open? And it sounds like that really helped in your situation, obviously.
Yeah.
What about you, Terry? You raised your hand for saying you felt the reunited did happen. How did that go? Were there things that were more helpful or that were a little bit awkward to work around at first? What was that like for you? Oh, you're muted.
I'm now 8 years older. So I'm 17 years old. I have a new life. I have a boyfriend. I have learned how to live without you. But my God, when he got off that plane, I was so excited. We went out to dinner, and it was just like having my brother and sister sitting there hating him and me just wanting to love him. And it was just like, I wanted to spend all of this time with him and do things. I was at his place trying to do or playing cards with him all the time. Then Christmas would come up and my mother would be, well, we're having Christmas dinner at that time. Your father can't have it at that time. So then I'd be like, Dad, can we have it later in the day that day? Oh, okay, then we can do that. And then it would be, okay, I have to hurry up, but I can't eat a lot of food because I'm going to have another turkey dinner in an hour. So it was very hard that way to try to keep them both happy and not have my dad feel sad or my mother feel upset. Like, she flew him home. He was sick. She put him up in a house, and she made sure that I felt bad about that. She definitely did. And she started packing her bags, and I'll never forget it. You don't need me anymore. You don't need me. Your father's here now. I'm leaving. He's going to look after you. And it's like, no, please. Begging her, crying, like, okay, I won't talk to him. I won't do anything. I'll stay away. So I started hiding my visits, but I still seen him, and I still he was a very great man. He really was.
And it sounds like possibly him having some understanding that you were needing to do that and navigate that. How old were you when that was going on?
That was 16, 17 years old.
Yeah, so understanding you're still kind of under that roof and that you're kind of coordinating this, still very much a child at 16. 16 is still a child. So having that responsibility, and it probably helped a lot that he was willing to kind of fold over for that instead of doubling down and making you choose, right? Like, well, it sounds like you need to choose.
And
but
he wrote letters over the years whenever I was allowed to read them. Somehow I have them all to this day, and I can look at it and read them. And how is your sister doing? I tell her I love her, and I hope Mitch is doing okay. And tell your mother I'm going to church every Sunday. It's like, he never once talked negatively about her or anything. Like, it was just a positive experience from him. And I think that's why I gravitated so much towards him. And I think that made my mother feel very defensive towards me. Mm-hmm. And I accept that. And she does too, because I called her all out on it.
You kind of don't have a choice once you're called out, huh?
Called out just last year.
So next question, I'm going to hit Tammy first this time. So Tammy, how would you say parental alienation has affected you in your overall life?
Oh my goodness. This is something that I think I'm just realizing now. This is one of the big things, the cost. I'm looking back and I'm going, what was the cost of this? I mean, it wasn't just a relationship between he and I. He was very successful, wealthy. And I would have learned some of that. I never really got the opportunity to do that because he died when I was rather young. And just, I think so many things that he had encouraged me to do when I was a child, my mom sabotaged just thing after thing, like, you know, gymnastics and just all these opportunities that he tried to offer me. And all that my mom did was sabotage every single one, because that was what she did. So there's just a lifetime worth of costs that I've accumulated. I mean, an emotional and again, though, I thank my father for focusing on my mental health and helping me to at least take that into my adulthood. So I was able to go to college, and I was able to, you know, even taking psychology classes in college just brought more and more awareness, and I was able to build on that, so that my relationships weren't a complete disaster in adulthood. But still, I see the remnants. I see, you know, strained relationships with my children. I see where it cost me in my jobs early on, because I lacked, you know, I had a lot of anxiety and fear, just of that residual of just being with my abusive mother, and feeling like I hadn't had a father there, even though I had just a plethora of issues that kind of manifested in not huge ways, but definitely ways that cost you in the long run as an adult. And obviously with my own children is the number one thing. And several people have talked about the repeating patterns in their children, which kind of brought me to where I am now, because I was in a marriage for quite some time and then divorced for quite some time. And it wasn't really until my children were older teenagers that all of those things, though, they just kind of resurfaced again, which they do, and they will again. And so that's the cost. And then moving forward, I worry about, you know, the cost to my children, because I can even see as they're getting older, the relationships they're choosing. And again, I see some of the same patterns there. And of course, you can't do anything to stop that, except try to raise awareness and become part of the answer.
Yeah, and not even just awareness like external, even just by researching it, hoping that you can learn something to kind of help, you know, stop the cycle. Like, so hopefully you learn something that it doesn't go that way for your children, right?
And other people's children too. And like I think I had some key people in my life. I want to be one of those key people that looks for this in the future. And if we could all look out for it, just be aware of it and look out for it in each other's children, there's a lot of opportunities where one person can really make a pretty big difference when they start to communicate with that child and open up some mental space for that child. Just a few key phrases or sayings, or developing critical thinking with children, you know, to allow them to assess a mental health situation.
And then what about you, Gareth? What would you say has been the overall impact on you and your life?
All right. So, for one, I mean, there's obviously the relationship with the father, which is, studies are showing, more important than most people understand. Both mother and father play an integral role in bringing a kid up. Both have certain traits that the other generally doesn't. Mothers tend to be more nurturing and care more about kind of certain details, whereas men tend to be more rough and tumble, playful. And these are things that children actually need to develop properly. Beyond lacking that, I lacked a counterbalance to the influence that my mother had. Now, I'm not going to say that she was a negative influence in my life, but she definitely wasn't a guide sign. She just definitely didn't point me in the right direction. A lot of things that she did for her attention. I want to be the cool mom. Okay, you know what? You shouldn't finish high school. You should take a year or two off, go travel Europe. Okay, sounds great, except for you're not providing me money that other kids who do that tend to have. So I'm now out of high school, living on my own, working a minimum wage job with these plans of grandeur of traveling the world, but no concept of that reality that I should have at this point. another aspect that really affected me was my sense of what it is to be a father. Was, I'm going to say, slightly perverted. Lacking my father, I have this, I mean, my paternal instinct is a little bit stronger than maybe it should be. And that made me very fearful of my ex-wife. I literally walked on eggshells for her, afraid that she has all the power. Also, talking about the counterbalance, a couple of people touched on this earlier, was this whole, oh, you don't need me, I'm not important, kind of the whole seeking sympathy. I don't know how many times, you know, I have an issue and I get in a fight with my mother and she goes, well, what about me? How about how I feel? It's like, well, hold on, wait a minute. I'm the kid here. I'm the one who had the problem. And now you only care about what you want. What about me? When do I matter? So I kind of grew up constantly feeling that the way I feel is not important. I have to subjugate myself to other people, particularly women. Men, screw you. I don't care. You don't like me? Go away. I don't have time for you. Whereas women, I kind of tend to, not intentionally, but be extra sensitive to their needs over my own. And so, I mean, summarize, I mean, I lost out on a relationship, developmental issues, sense of self. And I think for me, the biggest thing is a sense of loss. I lost all those years with somebody who every memory I have. I remember him being a scout leader, carving faces out of apples. I remember him playing field hockey. I remember him eating a bumblebee on a piece of steak. You know, these are the things I remember versus, you know, all the stuff that I didn't get. And I think that's probably what affects me the most, is knowing what I should have had versus what I didn't because of one person.
There's something you said that really resonated, and I just want to do a quick raise hand check. When do I matter? Who else like kind of grew up with that question in your head a lot in our little group here? Yep, hands. Terry's nodding. So yeah, when do I matter? That hits me in the feels.
I have an ex-girlfriend who really kind of beat it into me that I do matter, and it's not all my fault. When I first got divorced from my wife, about a year later, she started to date a new guy, and her behavior changed. She tried to push me away, and she admitted to it years later that that's what she was doing. But my friends, my girlfriend, were like, smarten up. It's not all you. You can't take on all the blame. And yeah, how you feel does matter.
So moving on to Deborah, how do you feel that this has affected you in your life?
I have to say it's really been substantial effect. I've struggled for most of the years with depression and anxiety. I mean, it's controlled, but still, I think dysthymia, a low level of depression, where most people start out at about a 0 in their day. I'm, you know, down. I've struggled with anger. I think I was pretty angry for a long time, and I went through years of therapy, years, to not just to address that, but to address everything that happened. And I think it left me with a predisposition to choose a narcissistic personality disordered partner. And I'm absolutely sure that's why I did. And my ex-husband hit it off great with my mom, if that's any indication. I chose a man to marry who was alienated from his father, and his mother chose to marry a man who alienated his 4 daughters from their mother. If I had known anything about this, had I even a clue or could have read some writing on the wall, I would have run. Should have run. You know, but like Amy Baker said in one of her studies, I had a 50-50 chance that either my kids would be alienated from me or that I would alienate them from their father. And so no big surprise there now. I think it's had a substantial effect on restricting my job success and my ability to work with authority figures in the workplace, most particularly females, because of my mother. I do get along with them. It's just, I think I have issues still that I'm still working on.
Yeah.
And I think probably the most healing thing that I've done is to become an advocate for other target parents and legislatively in order to try to change this, because it is devastating, not only to the target parents, but most particularly to the children.
But so Terry, how about you? What has been the biggest effects on you and your life? I think we're frozen. Okay. All right. So we'll wait on Terry. Maybe we'll circle back because I see everybody else is still moving. So I will go ahead and move along. So the last question, I just want to remind the backbone of this last one from the list, and then I'll move into some of the ones that we've been pulling from the chat, is to answer as a child, like your experience, you know, you were a child, you were alienated and growing up. Because I do understand some of us have some experience where we are now being alienated again, but mostly just speaking from the child perspective. Deborah, what advice do you have for other alienated parents and then other children who have been alienated as well?
Well, for the children, I think they are in such a tight spot. They can't be honest with anybody. And I speak from a friend of mine who has a daughter who's being constantly alienated by her father and stepmother of the child. And she's tried to get this child to talk to CPS. She's tried to get her to talk to her teacher. She's tried to get her to express the issues that are going on. And I was actually present and understand, you know, this kid, like I had mentioned, is going to go back home to dad's and has to live there. So no matter what she says or what she shares, she knows she's got to survive that situation. She is not free to tell the truth.
No.
And I think one of the hardest things that kids have to deal with is, you know, when they turn 18, yeah, sure, they're out of the courts. The courts have no control over them, but they don't just turn around. They may never turn around. And that is really devastating. A thought. If their frontal lobe develops, that's when their sense of conscience comes about. They may start reflecting back on things. I have some hope in my case. I mean, I've been 10 years without my kids, but little by little they have thawed. They're getting, as long as they lived in their father's house, they had nothing but that constant, just like my mother in my ear. They've got it. But I've had some contact with them, and I will continue to use that to help them as best I possibly can and encourage them and encourage a relationship with them. But they're really, what is it? Linda Gottlieb, I think, says that it's like you inoculate somebody from yellow fever and then you stick them right back in the swamp. I mean, you know, what can you do?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then just anything specific for other alienated children like us who are now adults, like, you know, anything with the healing that you recommend kind of looking into? A lot of us are still healing from this as adults.
Yeah. There are so many more tools available to, you know, folks now. I wish there was more for kids. I really do. I want to write something at some point and say, hey kid, you've been robbed. You've been robbed of a relationship with one of your parents. I wish there was something that could be out there for them that they can tune into and hear these stories and this kind of thing, and actually realize that there's something that's been done to them.
Mhm.
I'm not aware, other than something like Welcome Back Pluto or something like that. I'm not aware of anything that they can really get a hold of, and so I guess I'm not answered your question very well.
I think you're answering everything just fine, Deborah. But since Terry was able to come back from her freeze
Yeah.
situation, I thought I'd go ahead and jump to you, and then we'll just back to this question as well. But the other one was, how has parental alienation affected you in your life?
It has destroyed my life. Seriously, I have just spent a year in therapy and trying to figure out how I ended up where I am at the age of 43. How did this happen to me? How did I get here? I was such a well-established person, and I lived in a women's shelter last year at this time. How is that possible? I don't know. So the abuse from my mother has circulated and has done